Hi, this is Jeff, the host of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I wanted to tell you about an app that can change how you plan parties and celebrations at your home. Drizzly. Drizzly is the most convenient way to buy beer, wine, and spirits with delivery to your doorstep in under 60 minutes. Are you hosting a book club party and you need a couple of bottles of wine? Well, keep in mind Drizzly. Or do you and your friends make cocktails based on your favorite book characters or novels? If so, again, use Drizzly. That's DRIZLY.com. Drizzly is the #1 app for alcohol delivery. Again, that's Drizzly, DRIZLY.com. And right now, if you act, Drizzly is giving every new customer $5 off their first order. Just use the promo code FAST5 at checkout. Are you on a search for a special holiday or birthday gift for a reader in your life? A reader who loves history? Well, I've got a suggestion for you. How about giving them weekly historic letters in the mail from Letterjoy? Every week, they'll receive a letter from a famous historical figure or an eloquent eyewitness to a major event. Past Letterjoy letters have included famous defense attorneys, the United States and China, or working on the railroad, exploring the American history of the railroads. For example, one letter was an engineer writing home to his wife to describe the tough process of laying tracks for the Transcontinental Railroad. Every Letterjoy letter arrives at your door on fine stationery or parchment with a real stamp. And each letter also includes the postscript, an article by expert curators on the latest letter and the historical figures and events connected to it. Visit letterjoy.co to give weekly historic letters to the historian in your life. And I have a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Use promo code BOOKS at checkout to get $5 towards your first order. Again, that's letterjoy.co, promo code BOOKS, to give a special gift to the reader in your life. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Richard Swan, author of the new fantasy novel, The Justice of Kings. Sebastian de Castel, author of the novel Spellslinger, wrote about The Justice of Kings. The Justice of Kings is equal parts heroic fantasy and murder mystery. Sir Conrad von Valt's fierce intellect and arcane powers will make you long to follow in his footsteps, but it's his young cleric, Helena, who brings heart and dazzle to the story. Together, they're a formidable team, and Richard Swan's sophisticated take on the fantasy genre will leave readers hungry for more. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It was very nice of Sebastian to say those things, wasn't it?
It is. Well, if someone listening hasn't yet heard about your new novel, The Justice of Kings, how would you describe the novel?
I would describe it probably as a epic fantasy murder mystery in the first instance. So when the early inspiration for the novel came from Robert Harris's Imperium, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's the first in a trilogy of novels about the old Roman consul Cicero, and that's actually where the narrative structure came from as well, because it's the sort of the second. Helena is telling the story of Sir Conrad, so it's a kind of I'm a lawyer or a litigator by trade, and so I had this idea of introducing that aspect of my work and my life into a fantasy setting, and it kind of morphed into both having a kind of fantasy courtroom, fantasy lawyers aspect, but also an investigative aspect as well. So I wanted to bring in the kind of the more police procedural aspect as well. So yeah, I think it's a sort of a mix of police procedural, murder mystery, but there's a little bit of magic in there as well, and a kind of in a fictional fantasy setting. So I think when I pitched it to my agent, I said something like, it's Judge Dredd meets The Witcher, which which they obviously they liked. I think they keep pushing the kind of Judge Dredd / Witcher angle, but I'm not actually. I mean, you've read most of the book. I don't think the Judge Dredd is that good a comparison. I think it was sort of very convenient shorthand, but I think the main character is probably a little more cerebral than Judge Dredd is.
Sure. And I totally understand the Judge Dredd reference, because when I was reading it, I actually thought about that, because I will joke sometimes when I'm driving in my car with my kids, when I'm behind a really irritating driver. I wish I was Judge Dredd. The whole idea of judge, jury, and executioner.
Exactly. And that's obviously where the character of Sir Conrad von Bolt comes from. He's a one-stop legal shop, essentially. Has unlimited power within the confines of the common law to investigate and try crimes and pass judgment. So in that respect he's a Judge Dredd character. But I think I've seen people compare him more to Sherlock Holmes actually than Judge Dredd, which I hadn't thought about, but actually I think that's probably more accurate.
Sure. Well, in a lot of fantasy novels you might read a reference to a king's decree or something similar, but you never really see authors get into the legal system of a fantasy world, and your idea of justice as roaming the land and the legal system that underpins your novel and world building is really interesting.
Thank you.
You work as a lawyer, as you mentioned. Is that what prompted you to write The Justice of Kings?
It certainly was. It certainly was a big factor in it. Yeah, years ago, I had this idea for how most novels start with a kind of the spark of an idea, don't they? Especially lots of your high concept novels. So, and in this case, mine was, what if lawyers, but in fantasy? And I hadn't really seen it done before. Although I think I've since been told about Brandon Sanderson's Wax and Wayne, which I don't know if they're lawyers, but they sound like they're private investigators of some sort or another. But I mean, I'm not familiar with those novels, but I didn't know that it had been done before, and I just, in my head, start off with, it was just purely a courtroom drama, and the lawyers would have like a kind of what I called legomancy, which is a sort of, if you think about what kind of powers the lawyers would want if they could have magical powers, and this is where the nascent kind of Emperor's Voice started to come from, which was the idea to, if I was an investigator, what powers would I want? I would want the ability to sort of compel someone to give me a confession. I would want someone, I'd want the power to kind of speak to victims of crime if they'd been killed, murder victims. I'd want to speak to them and ask them, who had killed them, essentially. And all these, the power to turn animals and into witnesses and things, because they're everywhere. So it was thinking through the sort of different powers that I would want a lawyer to have, and as with all books, inspiration came from many different sources, but that was the kind of the very earliest kernel of the idea, which was many years ago now. And over time, it's been added to. I read other books. I played the video game of the Witcher, and a few other bits and pieces all started kind of feeding into it. But yeah, as I say, that early, what if lawyers, in space, no, but in a fantasy world, that was the kind of, exactly. And I was obviously drawing on my own experiences of the legal system at the time.
Sure. Well, as you alluded to very briefly earlier, the novel is narrated by a 19-year-old woman,
Yes.
a clerk, Helena Sadanka, the clerk for Sir Conrad von Bolt. And I'm curious about your decision for choosing her as the narrator. Did you ever consider, or did you ever draft part of the book writing from von Bolt's point of view?
I didn't actually. No, it was always going to be from a second party, and I think a lot of people have been slightly caught out by that, because I think they weren't expecting it to be Sir Conrad who's narrating the tale. I think the difficulty with a character like von Bolt is, he's this kind of slightly enigmatic, inscrutable character, very straight-laced, very kind of serious and a bit brooding, and I think. But he's so important to both the rise and the decline of the Soviet Empire in the novel. And so I think a character like that is an interesting character, and he obviously has his own arc. But I think to have had this story from his point of view would have been a mistake, because I don't think it would have been as interesting. I think, you would have seen all of his inner workings and his mind, the way his mind kind of worked and
Sure.
works around a problem. And it robs a lot of the dramatic tension from the novel, I think. And it also, Helena being what she is, Helena's character specifically, and she's kind of at this crossroads in her life. She's had a fairly horrible upbringing, but now things are going well, but at the same time, she's not sure if she wants to be a justice. So she herself is very uncertain about her own self and her future and her prospects. And so I think seeing the story through her lens, when she can put a lot more kind of emotional spin on events, just makes it a more interesting novel to read. And seeing how kind of von Volt's actions and, what he does impacts on her and I suppose it provides a slightly less, if Von Volt was to tell the story, he would say, oh, yes, I did this because it was obviously the correct thing to do at the time. Whereas Helena can kind of provide a more of a critical lens through which their actions are, perceived. And obviously she's in the novel, she's an old woman. She's telling the story from, you know that, yeah, that's not a spoiler. I was going to say that the whole book is premised on this. She's an old woman and she's kind of narrating the story from her, elderly future, so she can sort of inject some dramatic irony into the novel as well. So it was always going to be someone else. It was just making sure that I got that, and also the other reason I made it a girl as well was just to keep it that kind of. It's a because the novel is a kind of sort of parochial patriarchal society, the further out of Soviet you get, it enabled me to kind of examine a few other kind of themes as well. And so as the trilogy goes on, we sort of see, and we come into Sova, and we see how everything is equal there. The Empire will use you; they don't care who you are, or what you look like. Whereas out in the kind of out the sticks, where they spend most of the book one, it's still a very kind of oppressive patriarchal society. So it also enabled me to kind of examine other themes alongside the character examination of Von Volt as well.
Sure. Well, I know that The Justice of Kings is the first book in a trilogy. Did you plan or outline the kind of the story arc for the entire trilogy before writing The Justice of Kings?
Yeah, I did. Well, I mean, I had to actually contractually. I had to. I didn't initially when I planned the book. I had planned it to be a sort of like a Dresden Files-esque, series in which sort of one bot would solve a different crime, each book. But gradually that evolved into a trilogy. I tend to write trilogies. I think they're the most effective storytelling tool, and I like them. I like reading them, and I like writing them. And so it evolved into that. And when I got my contract with Orbit, I had to provide an outline, fairly detailed synopsis of the second, third books, because my editor was like, "Oh, we've had some horror shows in the past where book two has just gone." It's been a sort of a high fantasy novel for book one, and then suddenly, book two, aliens, have landed, and it's sort of like, well, that's not what we signed up for, sort of thing. So, I think they like to kind of just check everything is above board before they, sign over the money. So, yes, I have planned it all out, and in fact, about to finish book two, and I'm part way through book three. So, just after the publication of book one, so it's all very well advanced at the moment.
Gotcha. So what was your initial writing journey that led you to writing and getting The Justice of Kings published?
I mean, it's a long one, really. I mean, I'm 32 now, and I started writing when I was about 12 or 13. Just one day decided I was going to write a story. I had my head sort of full of, the popular media at the time. I think it was sort of Star Wars prequel trilogy going on, and Halo video games and all this kind of stuff. And I had a head full of ideas, and I decided I wanted to start writing, and I did, and wrote my first kind of. I won't say novel because it was only about 20,000 words, but it certainly felt like a novel at the time. And since then I could just kind of fell into it as a hobby. It was something I kept ticking along. I wrote a book a year later with a friend, and then after that I wrote when I was in what we would call sixth form, which is kind of your final year of school. So 17, 18 years old. I wrote a book called Mindscape, and that kind of was really the blueprint for every novel I've written since, in terms of how I approach, novel writing, in terms of length and structure. So, I wrote that, and that was very important as a kind of developmental milestone. And then since then, really, it's just been a question of just keep churning them out. And for the longest time, it was just a hobby. And then when I got to about 2015, I think, the Amazon Kindle kind of KDP, self-publishing framework,
Sure.
had really kind of matured, and I sort of stumbled across it by accident one day, and I hadn't really heard anything about it, but I decided I was going to do that, because I hadn't written anything for a couple of years by that point. So I've always considered myself a science fiction writer. I've been a bit like you, I've been writing science fiction for many years. So this is actually my first fantasy novel, The Justice of Kings, but I self-published in 2015, 2016, 2017, I self-published a science fiction trilogy, and then a few other kind of spin-off novellas and prequels and things, and they did it pretty well. I was happy with those and the performance of those. And then I had a much more typical self-publishing experience after that, which was I self-published something, a sort of military science fiction novel, and did no marketing or anything like that at all, and basically it just completely tanked. Like nothing happened, no one bought it, and I thought, what, that was a year of time and effort. And it used to be like an end in itself, but now it's kind of, if I'm going to spend all of this time and effort on it, then I want a little bit of a readership off the back of it. So I thought maybe it was time to leave the self-publishing behind, and being traditionally published has been a long-term goal of mine. It's something I've wanted to do since I was started writing, really. So I came back to this, and I wrote The Justice of Kings, and and then from there, the path of publishing was actually a tremendously quick one. I got an agent very quickly, and then the Orbit, who I obviously got the deal from, they bought it, they preempted it quite quickly as well, within a month. So it was a kind of, they obviously everybody liked it. It was a straight shot to the publishing market. There was no kind of, which is fantastic for me. Obviously, there was no kind of years querying and all that, which lots of people have to unfortunately deal with. Everything, stars aligned and it just happened. So it's not the most inspirational story, unfortunately.
Well, you wrote a recent article on Chuck Wendig's blog about the fact that you wrote 1 million words of fiction before you wrote The Justice of Kings.
That's right.
What do you think you were learning as a writer with those 1 million words and those early stories and novels?
I think it's, occasionally I'll go, if I'm bored or whatever, I'll go back and look at my early writing, and I think it's never, of course I would say this, but it's never bad. It's always kind of like quite childlike. So when I first started in my early teens, even that the writing isn't rubbish in the sense of the sentence structure is bad or the syntax is bad. There's no run on. It's nothing like that. It's just the story is bad. The plot is bad and all that kind of thing. So I think for me personally, it's something I've always had a bit of a flair for. It sounds like a horrible brag, but I feel like the actual kind of technique of writing I've had for a long time. It's for me, it's been more about the kind of the plotting and the character arcs and things that I've had to kind of get squared away. And it's literally like anything. It's like learning the tuba. You've got to just put the hours in. And I did end up. Lots of people will be able to just write one book and it'll be brilliant. And I suspect those people who do that will be adults already. I think it's very difficult to start writing in your teens and write like an excellent book, because some of it comes with life experience, which is also important. So I think, it's very, very, very rare to see any kind of published novelist in their, teens or early 20s or even their mid to late 20s. That's quite rare these days. But so that's kind of speaks to, I think, just the sheer perseverance of it. And I just learned how to write a book. I mean, it's bizarre. It's so difficult to put into words because you know how a novel is supposed to go, right? I mean, you've read plenty of them. You kind of know the structure of one. And I think what writing lots and lots does is it gives you just more of an innate feel of when things should happen and how they should happen. And so the advice that you will get from anyone, any writer, is, if you want to be a novelist, you've got to read a lot and you've got to write a lot. And that's
Power Penny days are back, just in time for spring at JCPenney. Stock up on wardrobe staples to home essentials, like tees for the family, select styles starting at $7. Soak up the savings with $5 Home Expressions quick-dry bath towels in an array of colors. Or use your coupon to save an extra 25% store-wide. Incredible prices, spectacular savings. Hurry, ends Sunday. JCPenney. Offers and coupon valid 3/24 to 3/27. Some exclusions apply. See store or jcp.com for details. Power Penny deals excluded from coupon.
That's been the advice for for centuries. That's kind of the only advice you need to know, really. And that's all I've done. I've just written, I think it's about 1.3 million words. When I counted them all up, and I started self-publishing at about the 500,000 word mark, and I think that was when I hit my narrative kind of voice stride. So, if one looks back at my self-published stuff in 2015. The actual quality of the writing is basically the same as the Justice of Kings. Like it's no worse. I think the difference is there's no editorial oversight on that book. That's literally just me writing what I feel like writing. So I suspect it's probably structurally it's not particularly sound. And that's where and that'll always be the role of the editors, is to kind of cast a critical eye over the novel, and that's why they're so important, because as good as you think you are, there's always something you can do better. And so it's for me, it's been about honing that innate sense of, I start writing a book now. I've got to the point, because I've written so much, when I get pen to paper, it will be, my first draft will be okay. It doesn't need like endless revisions or so, because, as I say, because you've written that volume of words, you have just an innate feel of what needs to go where. Whereas I think another way of approaching it would be, like, if you wrote like one book, but then you revised it 10 times, or you rewrote it 10 times, that would be like the equivalent, wouldn't it? Like, if you'd never written before, you sat down and you wrote a book, and it would be, it would be terrible. But if you revised it, like, if you rewrote the book 10 times, it's kind of the same thing. If it was a 100,000 word book, it's kind of the same thing. All I've done is I've just written like 20 odd books, but they're all just kind of sitting on hard drives or whatever. They'll never see the light of day because they're rubbish. But what it's done is it's got me to that point where I can just kind of turn out a fairly okay novel in one pass, and that just takes time and practice. Like, as I say, like anything.
Sure. Well, you mentioned earlier that you had to write a detailed outline for Orbit. I'm curious in terms of the actual writing process for The Justice of Kings. Did you outline the novel extensively before you started wriing? What was that process like?
Yeah, I did. I do plan my novels, and I'm aware. Some people don't, which is extraordinary to me. But I think with this one, because there were so many moving parts in it, it's got when I write sort of what people would say political kind of scheming and plotting and things, because there is a fair bit of that in this book, and different factions. One thing I don't like especially in my reading and watching movies and things, is so many factions are quite kind of what's the word? Kind of monolithic. So you'll have like the Empire and the Rebellion, for example, in Star Wars. But there's no nuance there. It's binary. You're either one or the other. And I'm sure there probably is nuance in the kind of expanded universe, but just as an example. And this is like a kind of classic thing, isn't it? So, and what I wanted to avoid is just having like, the good guys and the bad guys. I wanted to have like factions within the factions, so to give it a bit of verisimilitude. So instead of just having like, in this novel, we've got the Savarin Templars, who are kind of one of the Neiman Marshall orders, and we've got, the Mulyanar Patricians, who are a faction of senators, and then you've got the Haugenate senators, who are kind of loyal to the Emperor, and you've got the Emperor, and so there's lots of moving parts here. But I wanted that because I wanted it to be more realistic. I wanted it to be like, well, not everybody who belongs to this group is going to believe in these things, not everybody who belongs to that group is going to. So I wanted to have the complexity, but if you write the complexity, you're making a bit of a rod for your own back. So I had to write it all down. I had to kind of plan it, not like in meticulous detail, because I like to give myself a bit of wiggle room when I'm writing a chapter. But I had to know where everything is going, and so that tends to involve, at the very beginning. And this is in many ways the fun bit is kind of sitting down and building the world, the sandbox. And so who are these guys? What do they want? Who are these guys, and what do they want? How do they kind of conflict, or how do they align? And once you've kind of, and it's the same as writing the murder mystery. When I write the murder mystery, I sit down and I think, right, the first thing we're going to write is what actually happened, so that once you've got this is how this person was murdered and this is who did it. Once you've got that all set out, that's the golden thread that runs through your plotting. So you can always it's like a kind of reference manual. You can always come back to it, and that's the absolute story. So to make sure you have the continuity, but so with this book, I did have to give it some serious thought and planning, because otherwise, I think you get into all kinds of trouble about halfway through.
Sure.
So yeah, I didn't do it for all of my books, but for this one, I definitely did. Yeah.
Sure. Well, you mentioned earlier that you are working on the third book in this trilogy now that you're writing it. Have you thought beyond that? Do you think that you'll write more Von Volt novels, or will you? You mentioned that you feel like you're a science fiction novelist. Will you see if Orbit is interested in the science fiction series?
I'd love to. I have spoken to Orbit. I did have some idea. I do have some ideas, and I do have some ideas for this sandbox. My current thinking is I'd like to keep writing kind of Empire of the Wolf novels, but advance the storyline like a few centuries each time. So a bit like Ken Follett's kind of Pillars of the Earth, where we're following generations of people as the empire kind of waxes and wanes over the sort of course of history. And the other day I was reading Fonda Lee's Jade War. Are you familiar with the Greenbone saga?
I'm not. I mean, I'm familiar with the titles. I haven't read them.
I mean, they're fantastic. You absolutely should. But it's effectively a kind of fantasy. It's fantasy set in the modern day, so it's a kind of like how to describe it? Sort of like a Godfather set in Hong Kong, and the people have magical powers, basically. So it's an excellent trilogy of novels, and she's done extremely well out of them, I think. But I thought, I could bring the Empire of the Wolf up to like the modern day, and just keep it going. So, I do have these ideas, and I'd love to write sci-fi, but I think at the moment, Orbit has both Orbit and my agent have kind of rightly said, well, you kind of need to stick with fantasy for now. I think for the foreseeable future, because you want to kind of be building up a readership, a base and stuff. So, if I do write any science fiction, it's going to have to be in my spare time, and probably release it as some kind of pen name or something, I think. But that's, I do have other ideas, but so much of it depends on how well the book sells and myriad different factors, as you can probably imagine.
Well, you mentioned earlier about reading and writing in terms of someone learning how to write. Is there other writing advice that you would offer for those who are working on their own stories and novels?
I definitely think, that for me personally, it's been about just getting as many words down on a page as you possibly can. And there's no substitute for that. I think, you can read all of the advice that you like, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to write a lot of stories. And I wouldn't write, if you have if one had like an idea that they really loved, I would probably save that for a bit later and just write some other stuff first, because I've got a couple of friends who like to write, and I think a big problem that they have is they want everything to be perfect. They want to be able to, they want it all to flow smoothly from the get go, and of course it won't. You couldn't just pick up a saxophone and start playing it. You have to learn the kind of the basics, and then you have to practice loads. And so I think ultimately, and I don't think I'm going to be able to add anything that other writers haven't said before, but it really is just about grinding out the words, persevering. And if you are serious, I mean, people say if you're serious about being traditionally published, you kind of have to know the market, but I don't even think you need to know that. I mean, I think you just have to write what you want to write, because that will always be your best work. Never write something that you feel will be a commercial success, but that you're not passionate about, because that will never work. And the rest will follow. But it really is a numbers game. With novel writing, it's just about churning it out, which takes time. Unfortunately, it takes many years to do it. But there it is. That's all I've got. And I don't think I'm hardly a kind of the most successful author in the world. So people probably don't care what I have to say, but that's
Well,
that's it.
Well, what novels have you read recently that you enjoyed?
Well, I mean, as I say, the Greenbone saga I'm reading at the moment. I read Jade City a few years ago, and it blew my mind. It was excellent. And then Jade War is also extremely good. It's the second one, and it's taking a turn into kind of geopolitical fantasy. She's built this whole world. It's like a fictional modern world, and it's sort of like it's Cold War-esque, political fantasy. I mean, it's fantastic. I've never read anything like it in my life. I think Orbit are doing fantastic work at the moment. I really enjoyed Josiah Bancroft's Tower of Babel series. I thought those are some of the best novels I've ever read. I recently read the Book of Coli by M.R. Carey as well, which is excellent. Sort of Ridley Walker-esque post-apocalyptic fantasy. So, yeah, I mean, it's just I've got Stormblood up next, which is by Jeremy Zal, who's another Australian. I mean, I'm not Australian, I'm British, but I just live here. But he is Australian, and I'm going to read his book next. I'm really looking forward to that. That's much more back in my wheelhouse. That's a kind of, I think it's like a cyberpunky, sort of military sci-fi-esque space opera. It's a cross-genre, sci-fi novel, but I'm really looking forward to it. So once I finish Jade War, that'll be next on my reading pile, and then I tend to sort of dip in and out of some Second World War non-fiction whenever the mood takes me. Still find that interesting.
That's great. Well, where can people find you online if they'd like to learn more about you and the Justice of Kings?
I'm most active on Twitter. I have my handle is Richard_S_Swan, and I have a website which I periodically / infrequently update, which is just stonetemplelibrary.com. And then I have the various other social bits and pieces, but I'm very findable these days, as is everybody, sadly.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Richard Swan, author of the new fantasy novel, The Justice of Kings. The novel is available now, so go buy a copy. And Richard, thanks for doing this interview.
Oh, thanks very much for having me, Jeff.
Great. Now, stay tuned for a brief excerpt from the audiobook of The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan, narrated by Lucy Patterson. Available wherever audiobooks are sold.
It is a strange thing to think that the end of the empire of the wolf and all the death and devastation that came with it traced its long roots back to the tiny and insignificant village of Rill. That as we drew closer to it, we were not just plodding through a rainy, cold country 20 miles east of the Tolsberg Marshes. We were approaching the precipice of the Great Decline, its steep and treacherous slope falling away from us like a cliff face of glassy obsidian. Rill. How to describe it? The birthplace of our misfortune was so plain. For its isolation, it was typical for the North
Power Penny days are back, just in time for spring at JCPenney. Stock up on wardrobe staples to home essentials, like tees for the family, select styles starting at $7. Soak up the savings with $5 Home Expressions quick-dry bath towels in an array of colors. Or use your coupon to save an extra 25% store-wide. Incredible prices, spectacular savings. Hurry, ends Sunday. JCPenney. Offers and coupon valid 3/24 to 3/27. Some exclusions apply. See store or jcp.com for details. Power Penny deals excluded from coupon.
Progressive presents Forced Metaphors about bundling your home and auto.
In sports, 3 goals is a hat trick. And when you bundle your home and auto with Progressive, you get a hat trick of great savings and round-the-clock protection. So you might be thinking, wait, that's 2 things. A hat trick is 3. But in this metaphor, great savings counts as 2 goals, and so does round-the-clock protection. So it's like 4 goals, and that's more than 3. It's basic math.
Forced Metaphors. Presented by Progressive. Bundle and protect today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Discount not available in all states or situations.
of Tolsberg. It was formed of a large communal square of churned mud and straw, and a ring of 20 buildings with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs. The manor was distinguishable only by its size, being perhaps twice as big as the biggest cottage, but there the differences ended. It was as tumble-down as the rest of them. An inn lay off to one side, and livestock and peasants moved haphazardly through the public space. One benefit of the cold was that the smell wasn't so bad, but Von Volt still held a kerchief filled with dried lavender to his nose. He could be fussy like that. I should have been in a good mood. Rill was the first village we had come across since we had left the Imperial Wayfort on the Jagland border, and it marked the beginning of a crescent of settlements that ended in the Hauna fortress of Seagard 50 miles to the northeast. Our arrival here meant we were probably only a few weeks away from turning south again to complete the eastern half of our circuit, and that meant better weather, larger towns, and something approaching civilization. Instead, anxiety gnawed at me. My attention was fixed on the vast, ancient forest that bordered the village and stretched for 100 miles north and west of us, all the way to the coast. It was home, according to the rumours we had been fed along the way, to an old Dradist witch. "You think she is in there?" Patria Bartholomew Claver asked from next to me. Claver was one of 4 people who made up our caravan, a Neiman priest who had imposed himself on us at the Jagland border. Ostensibly it was for protection against bandits, though the Northmark was infamously desolate. And by his own account, he travelled almost everywhere alone. "Who?" I asked. Claver smiled without warmth. "The witch," he said. "No," I said curtly. I found Claver very irritating. Everyone did. Our itinerant lives were difficult enough, but Claver's incessant questioning over the last few weeks of every aspect of Von Volt's practice and powers had worn us all down to the nub. "I do." I turned. De Bain Bressinger, Von Volt's taskman, was approaching, cheerfully eating an onion. He winked at me as his horse trotted past. Behind him was our employer, Sir Conrad von Volt, and at the very back was our donkey, disrespectfully named the Duke of Bronzy, which pulled a cart loaded with all our accoutrements. We had come to Rill for the same reason we went anywhere, to ensure that the Emperor's justice was done, even out here on the fringes of the Sovan Empire. For all their faults, the Sovans were great believers in justice for all, and they dispatched imperial magistrates like Von Volt to tour the distant villages and towns of the Empire as itinerant courts. "I'm looking for Sir Ottmar Frost," I heard Von Volt call out from the rear of our caravan. Bressinger had already dismounted and was summoning a local boy to make arrangements for our horses. One of the peasants pointed wordlessly at the manor. Von Volt grunted and dismounted. Patria Claver and I did the same. The mud was iron-hard beneath my feet. "Helena!" Von Volt called to me. "The ledger!" I nodded and retrieved the ledger from the cart. It was a heavy tome, with the thick leather jacket clad in iron and with a lockable clasp. It would be used to record any legal issues which arose, and Von Volt's considered judgments.